What about that big giant in Asia, Japan, the world's third biggest economy, embarking on a very ambitious program of economic reform under the Prime Minister Shinzo Abe? It's been called Abenomics, and many people are saying, look, it's early days yet, we'll see how it goes, but basically increasing government spending by about $100 billion, pumping money into the financial system, some structural reforms in labour and so on and so forth. But do you think at the IMF that Japan is on the right track? I mean, it's had, what, more than 20 years of economic slump.
20 years of recession, exactly. I mean, we welcome the Japanese government policy, take the decisive actions and move the economy out of the 20 years recessions. I think this is good for Japan, it's good for the whole world, and that's the sort of or basic things. We see Japan will have a good growth because of the fiscal stimulus. The Japanese government have roughly 2.2% GDP for new actual fiscal stimulus.
That's the government increasing its spending.
So we'll bring roughly 0.7% GDP growth for this year and 0.5% GDP growth for next year. So this is good, But nothing's for free, So because you increase the government spending, that means you borrow money. Japan has a very high government debt already.
Sure.
So they will bring the debt ratio over 250%. So the key issues, we think currently take decisive policies are absolutely important, but the government also have to take seriously the medium-term fiscal consolidation plan to make sure be able to stabilize the debt side.
All right, and of course there are a lot of concerns globally, big economies, that all this will amount to a weaker yen, which will make Japan's exports obviously much cheaper and more attractive, therefore, which is going to bring up a whole new set of issues and tensions. And that's a possibility, isn't it?
Well, I think the global community has been very cooperative. People understand after 20 years of recessions, it's a good news for Japan to move forward. So they're willing to cooperate with the Japanese
and let the yen go down. Let the yen go down. You think they're relaxed
in a certain way?
Because we've heard rumblings of discontent, US, Germany, perhaps, about the yen.
Yeah, we heard the comments in the various ways, but the people obviously still take a more sort of supportive way, and if the policy can work, take the Japanese out of 20 years recessions. But a few things are very important. Obviously, the first is you want to really the currency stabilize, which then will help for the global financial stability as well, and not too much volatility.
All right, so the IMF is keeping a close eye then on what's going on in Japan, clearly.
They do.
Yeah, as an Asian yourself, Chinese obviously, how do you feel working at the IMF? Because you're familiar with the criticisms that it is mostly run by the West. I mean, the West make up more than 50% of the voting rights in the IMF. As somebody who's Chinese, how does that make you feel?
Well, the fund is a quarter-based institute. The quarter have to reflect the real global economic structure changes. So in the past few years, the fund goes through what we call the governance reforms, bring more emerging markets into the funds, as means increase their shares, increase their voice.
But even as things stand now, Belgium, with 11 million people, has more voting rights than Brazil, with nearly 200 million, and Belgium only slightly less than India, with more than 1 billion. And you just look at the figures and you think, this can't be right.
After 2010's reform, we will. There's two issues. One issue is the GDP level. Another issue is the quota formula, because the quota formula has so many different variables. It's a little bit of technical, I have to say.
Very briefly, if you make it simple, but I mean, my main point about the fact that the West represents only 12% of the global population, and yet their combined voting share in the IMF is more than 50%, is a valid point. And people say they control it. However that's reached. Is that a valid, that is a valid criticism?
No, that was the valid criticism. So that's the reason we have a 2010 governance reform. After governance reform, all the emerging economy will be the top 10 shareholders of the funds. And in Asia, in addition to Japan, India and China all be the top 10 the shareholders of the fund.
And
so they will change the whole thing.
Okay, and because at the moment I think Asia has about 20%, is that right, combined voting power on the 24-member board, but the IMF contributions that Asia makes are only about 16%, and I think the EU and the US together make up more than 50%. So a country like China, is that going to be prepared to pay more into the IMF as a result of having a greater say?
Well, that's the rule. I think the 2010 gave the China voting rolls roughly around 6%. So China have to pay for that 60% and get the 60% of voting power and the voice. I think it's the same thing for all the other countries as well.
And that will be 2014. We'll see that happen.
It's a 2010 reform.
It was a reform,
Yeah,
but when will it actually be implemented?
Exactly, and the deadline actually is October 2012, and so we passed that.
You passed the deadline. It still hasn't changed.
We still haven't done deal yet. And
why?
It was the G20 initiatives 3 years ago.
In 2009, that's right.
In 2010, in fact.
Yeah.
And but today, in all G20s, but one country haven't validated the reform yet. So we need, because this is a major issue, we need roughly 85% voting powers. So we're still waiting for.
Still waiting, because even as recently as October 2012, the governor of the Bank of Korea, Kim Chung-soo, said the IMF does not reflect Asia's interests effectively in its decision-making process. You accept that that's one of the reasons why, or key reason why, the IMF lacks legitimacy in Asia?
Yeah, the fund have to keep reform, keep the governance reform, bring the shareholding structures, quota structure, voice structure, properly reflect the change of the world. So then we have the legitimacy. Otherwise, that's very true.
All right, so when a former ambassador for Singapore at the United Nations, Professor Kishore Mahbubani from Singapore, says that there is an indisputable correlation between IMF assistance and Western interests, which reflects the fact that they control the IMF as things stand still. Does that mean that when we see Asia having a bigger say at the IMF, that you'll see the IMF perhaps reflecting the geopolitical interests of Asia more?
Which is not the case.
That's not going to happen?
I don't think. The voting power is that one thing, but the one most important principle for fund is even-handedness. So we're dealing with the different countries in different cases, but we have to maintain the fairness, maintain the transparencies. So we treat every member the same standard, same policy. I think this is absolutely.
Is that the case, though?
The voting power is true. I mean, this is different, reflect the different economic strengths, the different market positions as well. But overall, at the fund, the even-handedness is the most important principle.
And has it been, when you look at Greece now, and the fact that the IMF had an internal report which was all over the press very recently, when you look at the funds that the loans that the IMF makes, I mean, it's like 64% go to Europe, and next year, 2014, it's something like 80% of funds, the IMF's funds, are earmarked for Europe. That makes you wonder whether that point that Professor Mahbubani makes, that actually IMF still reflects Western interests, is a valid one.
Not really, because the fund job, the lending facilities only go to the country when they have a crisis. Because this time, all the crises happen into the Europe. So all our loan more or less concentrated on the Europe. But if you're looking for the 1997, the crisis in the Asia, most of the lending facility from the fund goes to Asia as well. So you will see the structures are quite different. It very depends on where is the crisis.
All right, so the crisis, as we said, is in Europe, and principally looking at Greece, and not going to go into all the figures and so on, but it's had many, many billions of euros going to its assistance as a bailout. But the IMF has basically admitted when it came to Greece, it got it wrong.
When we think we got it wrong, what we think a few things. Number one, we did not have the proper information at that time. And so then we become a little bit more optimistic in terms of debt sustainability, in terms of the growth of things. I think it's very good for fund to do exposed reviews, which is the report about it. So then we learn from our experience. Then we integrate the lessons we learn from those experiences, move into the future operations.
You would have thought you'd learned from your experience. You would have learned from your experiences by now. As you said, you had the Asian crisis in the mid-90s and so on, and there was criticism of IMF policy then, for example, over Indonesia and so on, not properly assessing the impact on people socially and politically as a result of these austerity measures. But just staying with Greece, the IMF said it was basically over-optimistic in its assumptions about growth in Greece. So,
we did.
Why was that mistake made? Who's responsible for that mistake?
There's a few things. The most important issue is, there's two things. One thing is we did not have a proper information at that time. For example, the information we get did not necessarily reflect the physical conditions in the system.
So you didn't get correct information from Greece?
From Greece, yeah.
And the European Union?
Yeah.
And the European Union?
For example, even we also made the clear case, yes, we say we were a little bit too much optimistic, as he said, but if we go back to the same days, if today with the same information, same case, we probably will make the same decision.
You would have made
the same decision. Exactly. Because we did not break any rules, because that's the information that we have.
I'll just give you one example. You thought, for instance, that unemployment would be about 15%, and in fact it is 25% and rising all the time. It's now currently 27% in Greece. So you made wrong assumptions. But I want to put it to you, because there has been a bit of concern that there's been a bit of a blame game here, because I tell you what Olli Rehn, the European Union's Commissioner for Economic Affairs, says, I don't think it's fair and just for the IMF to wash its hands and throw the dirty water on the Europeans. He said that at a conference in Helsinki early in June.
I don't think we're washing our hands. We just try to learn from our experience. I think this is also good lessons, not only for us, but for everyone. And in addition, we're working with European Commission very well. We had a very good working relation as well.
Are you with the European Commission and the European Central Bank, the Troika, the IMF that gave all the money to Greece? Would you carry on working with them?
Yes.
And would you work with other financial institutions in the future, or do you think, oh, one lesson the IMF learned is, no, better go it alone?
It depends on the situation, because in European situations, I think it's better to have three parties working together. And yes, you heard the comments in other days. If you see the news in those days, as more and more people recognize the three-party working together is still the better solution.
And the IMF says it hasn't been blaming the European Union and the Greeks for, as it were, you might say, not giving you the correct facts.
Well, that is also not issues they want to hide or not, because that is information they had at that time, unfortunately. So it's the reason we had a big proposal for the fiscal transparency. All
right, very finally and quickly, you're currently deputy at the IMF. You think somebody from China like you could become head of the IMF soon?
This is very much, it depends on international community. I mean, this is, the fund have an open competition process.
Do you think you might be a future head?
I don't think I will.
All right. Zhu Min, thank you very much indeed for coming on HARDtalk.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Good.